Imagine a cozy cafe on the outskirts of San Francisco, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingles with the aroma of pastries, and the morning light gently penetrates through large windows, creating an atmosphere of peace and tranquility. Dark wooden tables are arranged at a comfortable distance from each other, giving visitors a sense of personal space despite the morning rush. The walls are adorned with paintings by local artists, city landscapes showing San Francisco at different times of day and in different seasons. Subdued conversations and soft background music create the perfect soundscape, allowing you to focus on your thoughts or enjoy a conversation. It was in such a place that a story began which would overturn one person's perception of values and make many others think. In a far corner of the cafe, by a window overlooking a small park, sat a middle-aged man. Jeans worn to whiteness at the knees, a simple gray t-shirt without any brand markings, a well-used dark blue backpack lying on a chair next to him, and a 3-day stubble created the image of an ordinary city dweller, unremarkable among dozens of other patrons. His long, slightly curly dark hair was carelessly tucked behind his ears, and barely noticeable marks on the bridge of his nose suggested he wore glasses for work. The man was calmly reading a book in a worn binding, something from classical philosophy, judging by the gold embossing on the spine, occasionally sipping coffee from a white ceramic cup and making short notes in a small notebook that lay nearby. His movements were smooth and measured, and his gaze was focused and deep, as if each line he read found a special resonance within him. None of the cafe patrons casting casual glances at him suspected that this modestly dressed person was Keanu Reeves, a Hollywood star, a world-renowned actor, and one of the highest-paid representatives of the film industry. In one spot on the page of the book, Keanu made a mark with a pencil, very carefully, as if afraid of damaging the paper, and then closed his eyes, reflecting on what he had read. He was completely immersed in his inner world, shielded from the hustle around him by a thin but impenetrable wall of calmness. The small wrinkles around his eyes spoke of a man who had smiled a lot in his life, but also of someone who had experienced many difficulties and losses. Now these wrinkles had smoothed out as Keanu's lips relaxed into a slight smile. Apparently, some thought from the book seemed particularly close to him. The aroma of fresh pastries wafted through the cafe. The barista had just taken a new batch of croissants out of the oven and arranged them on the display. A student at a nearby table was photographing her cappuccino with a perfect milk foam pattern for Instagram, while an elderly couple in the opposite corner talked quietly, eating breakfast at a leisurely pace and planning their day. This was the usual morning atmosphere of the cafe, calm, filled with quiet conversations, the sound of the coffee machine, and soft laughter. But suddenly this harmonious picture was disrupted. The cafe door swung open with such force that the bell above it emitted a sharp ring, attracting the attention of the patrons. On the threshold stood a man whose appearance contrasted with the relaxed atmosphere of the establishment. This was Alexander Brooks, a successful investment banker from New York, who found himself in San Francisco to close an important deal. His appearance was like a flash of bright light in the subdued atmosphere of the place. A perfectly fitting suit from a famous Italian designer in anthracite color, a snow-white shirt with a perfectly ironed collar, a silk tie in a noble wine shade and cufflinks with rubies, handmade shoes shining as if they had just been polished, Swiss watches worth a year's salary of an average American, everything spoke of a man accustomed to luxury and attention. His light hair was styled with mathematical precision, and his skin had a characteristic golden hue, revealing regular sessions in an expensive tanning salon. His gray eyes quickly assessed the situation, and his facial expression combined arrogance and mild displeasure, as if reality never lived up to his expectations. Alexander was talking loudly on the phone, held between his ear and shoulder, while simultaneously checking something on his latest model tablet. His voice resounded throughout the room, disturbing the morning idyll of the cafe. He was discussing some important deal, not mincing words and not particularly concerned that strangers could hear his business secrets. From the conversation, it was clear that it involved millions of dollars and that Alexander was clearly the main player in this transaction, judging by how he gave instructions to his interlocutor. Keanu looked up from his book, momentarily meeting the gaze of the noisy visitor, but showed neither condemnation nor irritation, only a slight curiosity flashed in his gaze before he returned to reading. He shifted slightly in his seat, as if creating an invisible barrier between himself and the new visitor, but did so imperceptibly that no one would have suspected him of antipathy. Finishing the conversation with a statement that his interlocutor must close the deal by evening, otherwise they'd better look for another job, Alexander approached the counter and ordered an espresso, frowning in displeasure that the menu did not include his favorite Italian coffee brand. He began to explain to the barista exactly how his drink should be prepared, as if dealing with an inexperienced novice rather than a professional with many years of experience. The girl at the counter, a young barista with neat-colored strands in her chestnut hair and several elegant tattoos on her wrists, maintained a professional smile, although obvious irritation at such treatment could be read in her eyes. Alexander pronounced with a note of superiority in his voice that he would have to make do with what was available, and expressed surprise at how people could constantly visit places with such a limited selection. His voice was loud enough for everyone around to hear the comment, including the barista herself, who was clearly embarrassed by this remark. Nevertheless, she professionally maintained her smile and prepared the order with impeccable skill, despite the condescending attitude of the client. Having received his espresso in a small ceramic cup, Alexander examined the drink with displeasure, took a small sip, and pursed his lips. Apparently, the coffee did not meet his high standards. Then, he looked around for an empty seat. The cafe was almost full. The morning rush hour was at its peak, when office workers stopped by for coffee before the start of the working day, and freelancers and creative individuals settled at tables for a longer time. His gaze landed on the table where Keanu was sitting. Next to the actor was the only empty seat in the entire cafe. Alexander headed towards Keanu's table, his expensive shoes distinctly tapping on the wooden floor. He stopped at the table, appraisingly looking at the man sitting there in worn clothes. His gaze conveyed a sense of superiority and slight displeasure at having to share space with someone who was clearly in a different weight category in terms of material wealth. With the demeanor of a man accustomed to getting everything he wants, Alexander asked if this person would mind if he sat down, but his tone was more assertive than questioning. Without waiting for an answer, he was already pulling out a chair, demonstrating that the question was just a formality. Keanu looked up from his book and with a slight, almost imperceptible smile, nodded, moving his backpack closer to himself, freeing up more space. There was no servility to the expensively dressed man in his gesture, but neither was there a challenge or displeasure. Rather, it was a manifestation of the ordinary courtesy with which he treated all people around him. He calmly said that Alexander could certainly sit at his table, there were no problems. Deep, velvety notes sounded in his voice, and he spoke a little more quietly than was customary in everyday communication, as if inviting the interlocutor to also switch to a calmer tone. Keanu tilted his head slightly, examining the new neighbor with genuine interest, as if he saw in him not just a man in an expensive suit, but a whole story he would like to know. Alexander sat down, casting a fleeting glance at his neighbor. His appraising gaze slid over Keanu's simple clothes, worn backpack, and the cover of the book, some philosophical treatise, the title of which he could not decipher. His lips curved in a barely noticeable smirk, betraying an internal sense of his own superiority. His eyes registered bewilderment at how a person could look so indifferent to his appearance and status items. Deciding to start a social conversation, more to emphasize the difference between them than out of genuine interest, Alexander asked with a note of condescension in his voice whether the book his neighbor was reading was really that interesting. He added that he rarely meets people reading paper books in our digital age, especially such old-fashioned philosophical treatises, which, in his opinion, are of little relevance to modern life, where everything is decided by technology and capital. In response, Keanu calmly said that sometimes old ways of transmitting wisdom remain the most effective, and that there is something special about a paper book that a screen cannot convey. He carefully closed the book, placing a bookmark between the pages, and moved it to the table, indicating he was ready for conversation, although he had not sought it out. In his gesture was respect for the interlocutor, even if the latter did not show the same respect in return. Alexander raised an eyebrow slightly, sipping his espresso. His posture radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention and considering his opinion to be the only correct one. He replied that perhaps this was so, but progress doesn't stand still, and he prefers efficiency. His entire library fits on a tablet, and he can read anything, being anywhere. Alexander tapped his finger on his expensive tablet lying on the table, emphasizing the status of this item. He finished his thought with the popular phrase that time is money, saying it as if he had invented this concept himself. Keanu looked pensively at his interlocutor. There was no condemnation in his gaze, only genuine interest and, perhaps, a slight sadness. He asked Alexander if he had ever thought about what is more important, time or how we spend it. The question was not asked with the aim of putting the interlocutor in a difficult position, but rather as an invitation to a deeper conversation that goes beyond superficial small talk. This question seemed to catch Alexander off guard, but he quickly regained his self-confidence. Surprise flickered in his eyes for a moment. Apparently, he did not expect such depth of thought from a person whom he immediately classified as a loser. He replied that obviously both are important, but in our world, success is measured by results, not by philosophical reflections. Saying this, he leaned back in his chair, demonstratively adjusting the cuff of his shirt, from under which ruby cufflinks flashed. Placing his hands on the table so that his watch was clearly visible, he seemed to emphasize the material aspect of his definition of success. At nearby tables, several visitors began to furtively observe this strange dialogue. A young couple sitting closest exchanged knowing glances. They were clearly uncomfortable with the banker's tone. An elderly man reading a newspaper a couple of tables away from them lowered it to better hear the conversation, and a student with a laptop took off her headphones, interested in the unexpected philosophical discussion. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to develop his thought. Judging by the appearance of his interlocutor, he unlikely works in the corporate world, the banker presumed with poorly concealed condescension. Perhaps a creative profession? He pronounced the word creative with a barely noticeable irony, as if it were synonymous with the word non-serious. In his view, the world was clearly divided into those who create real value, that is, money, and everyone else who merely consumes what is created by the former. Keanu smiled gently, his eyes momentarily gleaming with a warm light. Not succumbing to provocation and not showing offense at the condescending attitude, he replied that one could say so. He indeed works in a field where it's important to understand human nature. There was neither boasting nor defensiveness in his voice, just a calm statement of fact. He did not specify his profession or somehow hint at his fame, maintaining a modesty that contrasted so sharply with his interlocutor's behavior. Alexander snorted when he heard about human nature. With a slight contempt in his voice, he noted that in his world, human nature is quite predictable. People want power, money, status. At the same time, he cast an appraising glance at Keanu's worn backpack, adding with undisguised irony that philosophical reflections are the lot of those who could not achieve material success, a kind of consolation for the unsuccessful. The cafe became noticeably quieter. Patrons at nearby tables no longer hid their interest in the unfolding scene. The barista, wiping the counter, also listened to the conversation, her face expressing sympathy for the man who was subjected to such arrogant treatment. Even the waitress distributing orders slowed her step as she passed their table. Keanu took a sip of coffee, showing not the slightest sign of irritation. His calmness was almost tangible, creating a strange contrast with the nervous energy of his interlocutor. He spoke quietly, but with an inner strength that made not only Alexander but also those around him listen, saying that the true value of a person is not in what they have, but in how they relate to others. Perhaps, he continued, the greatest wealth is the ability to see value in each person, regardless of their external attributes. His words did not sound like learned wisdom from books, but as a deeply felt conviction, suffered through his own experience. Alexander snorted like a man hearing naive childish reasoning. He set aside his cup with unfinished espresso and straightened up, as if preparing to give a speech to an unreasonable audience. Beautiful words, he began, but in the real world, a person's value is determined by what they can offer society, what material contribution they can make. Alexander proudly straightened his shoulders and practically looked down at Keanu from above, despite the fact that they were both sitting. He stated that he manages millions of dollars, makes decisions affecting the fate of companies and the jobs of hundreds of people. And what can his interlocutor in his worn t-shirt offer, besides beautiful but useless philosophical reasoning? His tone was condescending, and his gaze appraising, as if he was looking at not a person, but a low-value commodity. One of the women at a nearby table gasped at such straightforward rudeness. Her companion frowned, clearly displeased with the banker's behavior. The elderly man with the newspaper shook his head, and the student listening to their conversation looked outraged, ready to intervene. But Keanu maintained remarkable calmness. He merely nodded understandingly, as if he had heard exactly what he expected. In a quiet but confident voice, he said that sometimes those who talk the most about their achievements feel the greatest emptiness inside. Perhaps, he continued, true wealth is not what one can boast about or what can be measured by figures in a bank account. There was no condemnation in his words, only a deep understanding of human nature and, perhaps, a slight sadness from the realization of how much people sometimes err in setting life priorities. His calmness and friendly tone seemed to irritate Alexander even more, who was used to people either fawning over him because of his wealth and influence, or openly envying him. This strange man demonstrated neither, as if Alexander's material success was something completely unimportant, not worth attention. Alexander was about to respond with some barb, an expression of poorly concealed irritation already appearing on his face, but at that moment a little girl, about 7 years old, approached their table, with her parents standing a little distance away. She was dressed in a bright summer dress with superhero images, and in her hands, she held an autograph book. The girl looked at Keanu with wide-open eyes, full of admiration and barely contained delight, as if she had seen a real miracle in the middle of an ordinary day. Embarrassed, but gathering all her childish courage, she said shyly, addressing the man in the gray t-shirt, that she apologizes for the disturbance, but cannot help asking, is he really Keanu Reeves? She said that she had seen all the John Wick films with her dad, although Mom says she's too young to watch such films. Such sincere admiration sounded in her voice that even a stern banker could not remain indifferent. Absolute silence fell in the cafe. All eyes turned to the table where such different men sat. Alexander froze with a cup at his lips, his confidence instantly evaporated, and his eyes widened with the realization of whom he had been talking to all this time and how arrogantly he had behaved. A whole range of emotions was reflected on his face, from shock and disbelief to embarrassment and shame. As if someone had knocked the ground from under his feet, depriving him of his habitual confidence in his superiority. Keanu smiled at the girl with the warmest smile, which completely transformed his face, making him even more recognizable to all those present. The wrinkles around his eyes became more pronounced, and his gaze became so soft and kind that it seemed it could warm the entire hall. He confirmed that yes, it is indeed him, and extended his hand to the girl in greeting, as if she were an important person whom he was glad to meet. He asked what her name was, addressing her with the same respect with which he would speak to an adult. The girl enthusiastically replied that her name is Emily, carefully shaking Keanu's hand, as if afraid that he might disappear if she did something wrong. Her eyes shone with happiness, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement. Gathering courage, she asked if she could take a photo with him, adding that no one at school would believe that she met the real John Wick if she didn't have proof. Keanu agreed without the slightest hesitation. He got up from the table and crouched next to the girl so that their faces were on the same level for the photograph. His movements were natural and friendly, without a trace of the arrogance one might expect from a Hollywood star. Emily's father, no less thrilled than his daughter, was taking out his phone to take a picture, his hands trembling slightly with excitement. Alexander watched what was happening with an expression that mixed shock, embarrassment, and a growing sense of shame. He slowly lowered his cup to the table, realizing the full extent of his mistake and the inappropriateness of his previous behavior. His gaze darted between Keanu, now unequivocally recognizable as a world-class star, and his own hands, where golden cufflinks and expensive watches suddenly seemed vulgar and out of place. Mentally, he was replaying their conversation, each of his arrogant remarks, each condescending glance, and felt his face burning with shame. Meanwhile, Keanu patiently posed for several photos with Emily, then signed her notebook and even drew a small smiley face next to his autograph. He asked the girl about her favorite film and attentively listened to her enthusiastic story about how she and her dad watch all his films. Keanu treated this conversation with full attention, as if sharing important thoughts with an equal interlocutor, not just condescendingly chatting with a child. After the photos were taken and the autograph received, the parents thanked Keanu for his kindness and patience, especially noting how important this moment was for their daughter. Emily, still beaming with happiness, unexpectedly hugged the actor before leaving. Keanu, not at all embarrassed, hugged her back, whispering something encouraging. The family headed towards the exit. The girl kept looking back, waving to the actor, not believing her luck. The rest of the cafe patrons who observed this scene now looked at Keanu with respect, but, showing tact, did not rush to approach for autographs or photos, seeing that he had returned to his companion and would probably continue the conversation. Keanu returned to the table to a shocked Alexander, who seemed to have lost the power of speech. The banker looked at the actor with completely different eyes. There was no longer arrogance and condescension in them, only amazement and shame. His face was red, and his hands, clutching the cup with unfinished espresso, trembled slightly. Struggling to find words, Alexander finally squeezed out that he didn't know with whom he was speaking and offers his deepest apologies for his words and manner of communication. He looked so confused and embarrassed that even the most severe critic would feel some sympathy for him. Keanu shook his head with a gentle, understanding smile. He said that apologies are not needed, at least not to him. The point is not who he is, the actor explained, but how we relate to all people around us, famous or not. He leaned a little closer, as if sharing an important secret, and added that the world is created by people, and how we relate to others says more about us than anything else. His voice was quiet, but his words seemed to fill all the space around them with their deep meaning. Alexander lowered his eyes, for the first time during their conversation completely losing his self-confidence. He admitted that everyone in the cafe saw their conversation and probably remembered him as a complete idiot who tried to lecture one of the most respected actors in Hollywood on life. There was something almost childlike in how he worried about what others would think of him. Keanu replied that we all make mistakes, it's part of human nature. What's important is not what mistakes we make, but what lessons we learn from them and how we grow because of them. There was neither condescension nor preaching in his words, just the simple wisdom of a man who had seen a lot in life and learned to accept others as they are. At this moment, a middle-aged man in simple work clothes approached their table. He was one of those who had been observing their conversation from the very beginning. His hands were calloused, and his face was tanned and weather-beaten, revealing a man of physical labor. He looked embarrassed but determined when he addressed both sitting at the table. Apologizing for interrupting their conversation, the man said that he was sitting at a nearby table and heard all their conversation even before everyone knew who Keanu Reeves was. He admitted that he was touched by the actor's words about the value of a person. Introducing himself as a builder, he said that he often feels how people in expensive suits look down on him just because of his profession and appearance. At these words, he cast a fleeting glance at Alexander, who shrank even more, realizing that he himself was one of such people. The builder continued, saying that today he saw how someone who has really achieved success treats people with respect regardless of their position, and this gave him hope that the world can be better. Keanu gratefully nodded to the man, shaking his hand with sincere respect. There wasn't a drop of falsehood or condescension in this gesture, only an equal greeting and equal Alexander seemed to sink even deeper into his thoughts, struck not only by the celebrity's personality but also by the reaction of an ordinary worker. It was as if for the first time he saw the real world beyond his elite circle of communication, a world where human relationships are built on values other than money and status. When the builder walked away, Keanu began to pack up, carefully putting the book in his worn backpack. He said it was time for him to go, but it was interesting to chat. Despite everything that had happened, there was no sarcasm in his voice, only sincerity. Alexander, as if awakening from deep reflections, quickly stood up. He asked Keanu to wait, and then asked a question that apparently did not give him peace. He asked why a person with such status and wealth lives so simply, why he doesn't take advantage of all the privileges of his position. His voice sounded with genuine bewilderment, as if he had encountered a phenomenon that did not fit into his worldview. Keanu smiled that same calm smile that had become his calling card on screen and beyond. He said that, in his opinion, we are defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. True success does not need to be shouted about, it speaks for itself. From his words, it became clear that this was not just a beautiful phrase for the public, but a deep life conviction that he follows every day. With these words, Keanu slung his backpack over his shoulder and headed for the exit. Many patrons followed him with glances full of respect and admiration, but no one tried to stop him or attract his attention, as if understanding that they had just witnessed something special, a lesson in humanity and dignity that is worth more than any autograph or selfie with a celebrity. Alexander remained sitting at the table, thoughtfully twirling his expensive watch, which just an hour ago had been a symbol of achievement and success for him. For the first time in a long time, he felt that all his material achievements suddenly lost a significant part of their luster. He looked at the cafe patrons, ordinary people with their ordinary lives, and for the first time saw in them not just a background for his existence, but separate worlds, full of their own stories and values. And this thought was both frightening and amazingly liberating. A week later, Alexander found himself in the same cafe again. But now he was dressed more simply, in jeans and a sweater, without expensive accessories and striking details. He ordered a regular coffee and sat at the same table, examining the room with different eyes, the eyes of a man who had begun to see value not only in material things. The young barista who brought his order was surprised when he sincerely thanked her and asked how she was doing. She was even more surprised when she discovered generous tips and a note, "Thank you for the excellent coffee and the lesson I received in your cafe." Gradually, Alexander began to notice how his life was changing. He started spending more time listening to other people, instead of talking about himself. He began to notice beauty in simple things and find joy in moments that he had previously ignored. And every time he wanted to boast about his status or achievements, he remembered the man in the worn t-shirt, whose true value was incomparably higher than anything that external attributes of success could show. The story of this meeting quickly spread across social networks thanks to the cafe patrons who witnessed the conversation. Like many stories about Keanu Reeves, it became another confirmation of his reputation as one of the most down-to-earth and wise people in Hollywood. But for Alexander Brooks, this was not just a random viral moment. It was the day when his perception of the world and of himself began to change. And Keanu? He continued to live as he considered right, simply, modestly, and with respect for every person on his path. For true wealth, as he knew, cannot be measured by a bank account or status. It is measured by the depth of connections with other people and the ability to make the world a little better by one's presence in it. And this story teaches us that sometimes the most important lessons we receive from people from whom we least expect them, and in places where we least expect to find them. Because wisdom does not shout about itself, it speaks in a quiet voice that is audible only to those who are ready to listen. Friends, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me create more such stories that make you think about real values in our lives. Share your thoughts in the comments. Perhaps you too had an encounter that changed your perception of the world? I read every comment and always enjoy communicating with you. and in the next episode, another incredible story awaits you that will leave no one indifferent. Until we meet again, friends.